Check, check. Mic check, 1 2 1 2. Mic check, 1 2 1 2. Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of hands in the back. I think everyone can hear me clearly. Okay, awesome. Fantastic. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming and being here with us today. We're here for a discussion of the text No Cop City, No Cop World with one of the editors, Kamau Franklin. Kamau is a founder of Community Movement Builders. He's been a long-time community organizer for over 30 years. His background is as an attorney, and he lives in Atlanta with his family. So, but first, can we everybody welcome Kamau? Okay, so before we dive into the book, let's just start with just telling us any more about yourself that you want to share and maybe how you got into organizing.
Testing. Thank you all again for having me. Appreciate it. I'll give you out a short story, not the I was born by the railroad story. But I'm born and raised in Brooklyn. Anybody from Brooklyn? Yes, Brooklyn in the house, all right. Raised by my mom, older sister. My mother was, and I guess I tell the story often now, my mother was born in Charleston, South Carolina during Jim Crow. And so she would tell us stories about growing up under Jim Crow. One of the things that happened to her was when she was a girl, she was in a whites-only playground and was chased out by a cop. She was slow, and she got hit in the back by the cop with a billy club. And up until the day she died, which was 3 years ago, she had a raised scar on her back. So when you hear stories like that, obviously it influences your thinking about how the world works, what happens in the world. And it definitely influenced mine. It got me starting to do a lot of reading about the civil rights movement, which naturally led to sort of a progression around the Black Power movement. And in my teens and 20s, how old am I? 20s? In the late 80s. Early 90s, no reason for laughter. It got me reading a lot of Malcolm, and shortly thereafter got me organizing. And politically speaking, my politics then and even today have always been pretty set. They've been a radical black revolutionary nationalist politic. And what I mean by that is my understanding of the system, which when I see friendly faces, I think most folks understanding is that the system is inherently doing what it is supposed to do. It's not an accident, it's not a mistake, it is an oppressive force on our people and around the world. And we as a people have to fight it and have to overthrow capitalism. And the nationalist part is that black folks have a right to self-determination. We must organize our way, we can work with everybody and anybody, but we must be sort of the crux of the folks who are looking for the solutions for our community. Those things have stuck with me since being an early organizer, and they still persist today.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're going to dive into the book now. And the book describes itself, or rather, the book describes the Cop City movement as a decentralized effort to stop the construction of a $120 million police militarization facility and the devastation of the Weelaunee Forest. So can you first explain what Cop City is, and what are some of the key public and private actors behind it or that are pushing it, and then tell us about the Stop Cop City movement and how this book kind of came to be.
Okay. So I think as everybody knows by now, so Cop City is a militarized police training center. Its origins are before 2021. In fact, they're before the 2020 uprisings in terms of it was a plan that was not enacted. But as capitalists, in terms of talking about disaster capitalism or looking for opportunities, after the 2020 uprising, they saw this as an opportunity to push forth this militarized police center and to locate it in what we've dubbed as Weelaunee Forest, and to which is adjacent to a working class black community. Now, the 2020 uprisings in which, George Floyd was murdered, Breonna Taylor was murdered in Atlanta, Rayshard Brooks was murdered, brought out millions of people into the street after, or during, I should say, the COVID crisis, right? Like all of us, we were sort of stuck in our houses, and the murder of George Floyd and others became this great act in which people all around the country, if not all around the world, responded to in different ways. The system itself also saw this, right? And so when people were calling for the funding of the police, abolition of the police, alternatives to police. The system doubled down. And the system's response was, we need better methods and mechanisms and training facilities to stop people from taking over the streets, right? And so Cop City was dusted off as this militarized police center where the police, not only in Atlanta, but nationally and international Western police agencies, obviously including Israel, which we talk about in the book, would have places where they can train en masse on how to control oppressed populations and local populations. And so they themselves describe it as a militarized police center or training center. They themselves describe it as a military-grade training center. Some of the chief players, the Atlanta Police Foundation, all these foundations, so these foundations, again, are not new, but they became a certain size after the 2020 uprisings. Because, again, in the mind of the private and public actors that support the police, when people were calling for the defunding of the police, in their mind, they were like, look, we don't think this is ever going to happen, right? There's other mechanisms to control the funding of the police. But just in case some municipality or city or county starts doing this and it can't be blocked at a state level, what is the backup? And the backup was to put a lot of money, these same corporations that were telling you 2 years before that Black Lives Matter, a lot of money was poured into these police foundations to be an alternative to giving funds to the cops and private funds to the cops. So you had in Atlanta, not Atlanta-based corporations, but international corporations. Everything from Delta to Waffle House, Hewlett Packard, a whole host of national corporations that decided to give literally millions of dollars for the building of Cop City. In addition to that, the city itself of Atlanta obviously was a huge player in wanting to make this happen. The city designated large amounts of money to Cop City, 20, 30, 40 million dollars. The state of Georgia designated money for Cop City. So Cop City was always a public-private partnership. The other important thing about the Atlanta Foundation, the Atlanta Police Foundation, is that what you have now for the first time in history is a private foundation which is basically running the police training center. So it is not run by the Atlanta Police Department. It's run by a private nonprofit organization. They are the ones who are designing the training. They are the ones who are in control of what's happening in this militarized police training center which was built. They own property all across Atlanta, where they house cops in our communities and actually pay them stipends to report on what they see in the black community. And then lastly, the Atlanta Police Foundation set up the surveillance center or the surveillance system that encompasses Atlanta. Atlanta is the most surveilled city in the world outside of 5 cities in China. So all of that is set up by these outside players that act in conjunction with the capitalist class and with the black political class and obviously the white political class. So all of these folks are players, and as I often say, it's cops and capitalism which brings them all together, right? I know folks think of themselves sometimes as abolitionists and they talk about how we can abolish the police. The state will never allow us to abolish the police because the police is their mechanism for controlling us. So unless we're abolishing the state, right, we won't be able to abolish the police first. So all of these actors are playing together constantly in a role in which how do we get people off the streets and make them good consumers again, right? And that's what their bigger goal is. It's like we'll use whatever means and mechanisms, and we'll obviously get into this later, that they have at their disposal to control people and get them off the streets so that they can have a clear runway for controlling how construction happens, how development happens, how economics happens. We're not supposed to be involved in any of that. That is their purview, and we're supposed to be in our homes and be good consumers.
And then a little bit about the Stop Cop City movement and how the book came to be.
Yeah. So the Stop Cop City movement, outside after the 2020 uprisings, again, when I mentioned that the city itself began to dust off these plans, we as organizers and activists started to hear about these plans and what was going to happen. And it was immediately clear to us, as stated earlier, that Cop City was not just a building of a police training center, but it was a way for them to do two things, right? One was to make sure organizers and activists could not do this again, right? How do they make sure that they have enough crowd control? How do they make sure that they have enough connections in terms of how the city is run? How are they making sure that they're trained to get people off the street faster and quicker so that the urban disruption, so it's not just the marches and demonstrations, but it's about the destruction of property, right? In Atlanta, one of the big things that happened is that after Rayshard Brooks was murdered in Atlanta in a Wendy's driveway, someone burnt that down. They burnt down the Wendy's in a righteous act, to be honest with you. And folks went to several different places in Atlanta and either burn other property or knock down property, right? So it wasn't just that it was demonstrations that they couldn't control, but things for them had gotten out of hand in terms of the private property. They weren't worried about the fact that they'd murdered somebody. They weren't worried about the fact that of the over-policing or all the arrests that take place. What they were worried about was the fact that they could not get the population off the streets. It was reminiscent in some ways of the 60s and 70s during the Black Power height, when black folks were having rebellions all across the country. They were looking to control. So one reason for Cop City, or one thing that came out of it, was that we understood that this was a direct reaction to the rebellions that were happening post-2020. Secondly, this was a continued over-policing of our community, right? Atlanta, which is gentrified like most of these cities which have had large or majority black populations, have started to gentrify. And part of the ways in which that gentrification happens is the continued over-policing of our communities, particularly working class communities and poor black communities. Atlanta used to be 60% black, like 20, 30 years ago. It is now 48% black. But yet, over 90% of the folks still arrested in Atlanta are black people. So this we saw as a continuation of that. We recognized it right away. And really it came together on the ground from fellow organizers, right? Folks who were radicals, socialists, anarchist types, environmentalists. That was the basis. It wasn't like it was this big outpouring of different organizations across the country. It wasn't a nonprofit led, even though CMB has a nonprofit status. It was really folks who considered themselves radical grassroots organizers who started the Cop City movement, and then it grew from there, right? It grew in some great ways. There are some things which, I think we'll probably get into later. It never achieved the status, I would say, of a mass movement, but it became a movement that was popularized and became big because of the work that organizers on the ground started to put into it and the different tactics and strategies that were used in order to make it happen.
No, that's great. And since you already started mentioning tactics and strategies, maybe we can move into that. Because there was an incredibly wide range of tactics and strategies that were put to use, right? Including canvassing, petitions, children's march, a concert, direct action, and of course, sabotage, like burning of police cars and construction equipment. So can you speak about this range of strategies and tactics and those employing them and how they interacted with one another?
Mm-hmm. Well, I won't talk directly about who employed them, but we talk often like Cop City was a decentralized movement. And what we mean by that is there was like one group or one leader or one organization that developed tactics and strategies that were used. It was a mixture of different groups with different ideological persuasions and backgrounds and different ideas around what tactics should be used. So one of the things early on, maybe never conveyed directly in the early days, but something that was clearly understood, was that it was okay to use a range of tactics and strategies. Everything from, particularly the early days, town halls, regular like marches and demonstrations, sit-ins, all that stuff started to happen early in the movement. And as the movement progressed, more militant action became introduced into the movement, mainly because the city thought that they were defeating us anytime they passed new legislation to push it forward. They were obviously the taking over of Wolani Forest by forest defenders. So all of that was something that was in the range of tactics and strategy with lawsuits, environmental ideas. And so what was basically agreed to was, even if you did not engage in certain tactics and strategies as part of the movement, you would not put down and or go against the tactics and strategies of other movement players, right? So even if you were somebody who abhorred anything that had to do with destruction of property, you would never publicly say that, right? You would just keep your mouth shut. For others who maybe did not engage in those overt tactics and strategies that were militant, maybe groups like ours, community movement builders, which did more mass work, whether or not that was town halls, whether or not that was marches and demonstrations, whether or not that was media work, when they would put microphones in our faces, our role when it was like, isn't this violence that's happening on the street? You're doing things the right way, they're doing things the wrong way. Aren't they hurting your movement? Won't you condemn them, kind of thing? And it's like, no, we don't consider those actions violence. What we consider violence is the everyday arrest and oppression of our people. And you are not mentioning that, right? The murder of Rayshard Brooks, again, the over-policing that happened, that is violence. The destruction of property to us is not violence. No one died, right? The destruction of property is an outcome and an outgrowth of the oppression of our people at the hands of the police. Those were the answers that we gave. We never, even when we had disagreements, there was at one point where, let's say the timing of a direct action just was not the proper timing. We were doing a week of action, and part of that week of action, we had literally hundreds of people pour into Atlanta to be a part of that week of action. Music, concert, and so forth, a retaking of the forest after the forest was taken over back by the police after they killed Tegeta, and they arrested people on domestic terrorism charges. We had a week of action in which a lot of the force was taken back over. But on day 2 of that week in action, some of our friends did an action which, involved a couple of, like, a Molotov here and there. Nobody, not at anybody, but at equipment. And it just played into the press's hands of, wasn't this a violent movement, right? And that actually caused some people to leave the forest area or to leave Atlanta after they came for the week of action. So we did have big behind-the-scenes discussions about that, because we were like, look, why would you do that now? If you did it on day 5, which was the last day of the action, it was like, look, pizza resistance, we loved it. It would have been great, right? But they did it day 2, caused disruption within the movement. But again, even though people disagreed with it, it was never a public condemnation from the movement, right? So that was something we all understood, that these tactics and strategies were some of the things that allowed us to keep the movement going. Even at some stage, when we got to the referendum period, the referendum was something some people considered to be too electoral in nature. But again, the critiques and the criticism had to stay within so that we couldn't be divided and split. Lastly, I'll say, part of what the strategy of the city was to call some people outside agitators. And so by that, they meant that people should not be coming in out of town, or we're doing this other stuff, and this was not the Atlanta way. So to allow that to happen, or if we sided with the city or looked like we were siding with the city, we basically would be destroying our own movement, and we know we could not allow that to happen.
Yeah, no, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to actually put 2 questions together. I have a bunch of questions, and
He had like 30 questions.
Kamau knows that.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
It was a rich text. That was my excuse. It was a rich text. So first, you've already mentioned this long, violent history in the state of Georgia and in Atlanta in particular. There are 2 essays that go over that with more specificity, Boss Terror and a Brief History of the Atlanta Prison Farm. And I want to put that on the table with this other piece, right? So just first about this history. James English founded the Chattahoochee Brick Company in 1878 and then was elected mayor of Atlanta in 1880. Literally used the police to just make sure they always had a steady supply of free labor. The situation was so depraved at that brick company that it was later called the Brick Auschwitz of Georgia, which is funny because it actually predated Auschwitz by multiple decades. In terms of racist violence, between 1890 and 1930, more than 450 people, almost all black, died at the hands of racist mobs in Georgia. That's more than 11 people every year for 40 years, just to be clear. And then finally, Atlanta Prison Farm, which was formerly a municipal dairy farm, was eventually combined with the prison in order to, as they said, to save money. Indeed, by combining the stockade and dairy farm, some city leaders thought that they could save money on incarceration by making the new influx of incarcerated people work at the city dairy, and even generate revenue for the city. So that's the one piece, the very long history of the racist violence. But there's another element, which is the political economy, right? And Boss Terror goes into more of this relationship about how private capital and the state operate in Atlanta. You've already mentioned the Atlanta Police Foundation, which is the primary entity behind Con City. It's worth noting that they're the most well-endowed police foundation in the country. They saw a 15-fold increase in revenues after Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012, and a 45% increase in revenue between 2018 and 2019, up to $10.8 million. Most of this funding comes from philanthropic suites of high-profile corporations whose economic might is built on exploited labor, as you mentioned. Also in the book, George Jackson is evoked, who said fascism at its core is an economic arrangement. When workers refuse exploitation en masse and threaten the corporate bottom line, fascism attempts to renew the legitimacy of the economic elite by bearing down upon and diffusing unrest. The final piece I will share from the text is from H.H. Gibson, who in 1946 was then the superintendent of prisons. He bragged that he was cutting the city prison food budget in half and furnishing the city with 11,961 man-days of work on the city streets by prisoners within a 6-month period. This work heavily subsidized city operations and was considered crucial. It's worth noting that Kamala Harris, when she was in California, used a very similar line of logic to prevent the decrease in prisoners in California. Putting all this on the table, can you talk a little bit about how this history of violence and this relationship to the murder of black people by the police is connected to worker exploitation, and what that implies about fascism in this country?
So I think, Atlanta has an interesting history because, we talked about the Atlanta way a little bit. And the history of violence in Atlanta is out of control violence, like street mob violence, police violence, state-controlled violence, right, in terms of police violence, but also this idea of we're going to implement separate but equal as a way of lessening the amount of violence you get in Atlanta and or Georgia as compared to Mississippi or as compared to Alabama, right? So the way in which violence was used as a tactic and strategy, and also as a way to say that in Atlanta, the business interest wanted to have a smoother ushering in of ways in which they controlled labor, right? Even with the amount of violence that you mentioned. And so part of the Atlanta way in terms of the history of Atlanta and the violence, so people know about the so-called race riots, basically white mobs at the turn of the century, in the 20th century, early 20th century. Those race riots led to basically a deal, right? Those were the first sort of inclinations of a deal between the black bourgeois class and the white economic dominant class. And that deal was, look, we're going to try to prevent everyday working class white folks from coming back into these black communities. What we're going to do is give y'all a little money to keep you separate over here. And hopefully that little bit of money will help you control your people, and then we'll control ours. And then black people will continue to be used as an exploited labor class. Like, obviously not put like that, but that was but basically what they were trying to do. That deal basically went into play where you had black ministers and preachers who were the recipients of resources or goods to build substandard housing, but yet more housing than some other areas of the country got in terms of black housing, right? That was the deal up until the civil rights movement. Atlanta had a civil rights movement, but most of the civil rights movement that took place outside of Atlanta, even though a lot of the leaders came from Atlanta. Because again, the business class and the political class struck a deal with burgeoning not only civil rights class, but also, because of the population of Atlanta, the soon-to-be black political class that was starting to get elected in the 70s and 80s to higher office, which again was almost like a post-apartheid South African deal, which is we will continue, the white economic class, the white political class, we will continue to control the economics and the labor of this city. You will get to have political power and feel good about yourselves as long as you don't do anything crazy, like step outside the bounds of capitalist development. The only time in which any of that started to happen, Maynard Jackson, first black mayor during his first term, started to try to do a little bit of stepping out, but he was quickly admonished or put back into check. By putting back into check, what they have at their disposal is outright violence, over-policing, bond issuing, credit ratings. All that to say is, if the black political class, which for the most part was happy or content to be allowed to play a certain game, but if they stepped out of that orbit, then there was ways to rein them back in. Now, talking about the fascism, black folks have always lived under fascism. Now, we talk about Donald Trump and other folks or whatever. Black folks have always lived under a fascist regime, where the state's first recourse to the black community was either violence and the threat of violence, right? And we can see that through our history of the civil rights movement, our history of black power movement, particularly, again, going to the 60s and the 70s, but even before that, right? The violence that you mentioned, the lynchings, the murder, the over-policing, that is what fascism is. It's controlling a population by the pure use of violence at any time at its disposal. No propaganda games, no psych ops, no jobs. We will control you through the force of violence. And that'll be both violence by the state and violence by individual actors that are maybe tied to the state, but basically, again, groups like the Klan and other groups. Our leaders have been murdered. Our organizations have been destroyed, right? George Jackson, again, famously, fascism is already here. He was talking about the use of violence, state violence, against our communities that was already happening. There's nothing new for us in terms of what is happening. Maybe for other communities, they're scared because it's more overt. But our communities have always suffered under violence. And that violence has always been a fascist violence. It's always been a violence of the state to control us from political organizing, right? From self-determination, from fighting against capitalist oppression. So there's ways that in particular it's happened in a city like Atlanta, which in some ways is why you have the black elites themselves who are ushering in Cop City, because they're serving a certain role in terms of that history of fascism and violence within the community, a role again that they have been happy to serve, knowing that by serving that role, that they've been dispensing the black working class and poor population of Atlanta, which I think obviously any reading of history in DC will be very similar in terms of how that works in terms of the black bourgeois and or the black misleadership class.
Yeah, you're getting ahead of me, but thank you. Yeah. No. Okay, we'll move on to the environmental piece. Right, as you said, right, Cop City is being built in Weelaunee Forest, right? Weelaunee Forest is also known as the South River Forest, is a large, undeveloped and forested area in southeast Atlanta, Georgia, and it's historically significant as the ancestral home of the Muskogee people. So what can you say? Can you say a little bit about the massive environmental impact this facility is going to have, and then how that ties into the ongoing trends of environmental racism?
Well, as stated earlier, the Weelaunee Forest is next to or adjacent to a working class black community. There were already plans that were supposed to be made to keep that forest intact. And by keeping that forest intact, there were supposed to be walking trails, campsites, biking trails, playgrounds. All of that was supposedly for the working class adjacent black community to use. Again, the 2020 uprisings happened, and all of those plans are basically swept off the table. And in its place is the idea of Cop City. Cop City, which again tears down, literally in its first iteration, 100 acres of forest. Forest that helps protect the larger community from flooding. Again, forest that was designated to be used in a way that sustained that larger community was now wiped away. Some of the environmental degradation, even of that area you mentioned earlier, part of that area has always been used in a sense as a former plantation, as prison grounds, as youth camps. The part of the degradation is that at some point they were supposed to have over 12 firing ranges adjacent to a larger community. They were supposed to keep the youth prison there. And so imagine also the youth prison that's there, that's mostly filled with black youth, that is hearing daily shooting from the police as they're training right next to that forest. A reworking of roads and closures of roads, which for that community that lives there would have to readjust how they even travel in terms of getting to their homes and so forth. So a lot of the degradation, you know, in terms of the water and everything else, and the part of the Cop City is supposed to be used for fire training and police training. Again, a lot of that forest being designated to be torn down, it just meant that the people would just no longer have access to that particular area of ground. That became a big highlight of the work that we tried to do, because they skipped a lot of the environmental checks that were supposed to be done to even use that area. They didn't do soil tests, they didn't do water tests. They just skipped all of that. There were several lawsuits that tried to bring that out, but again and again, the city would say that the city and the courts would just bypass that and say that's not our issue right now. The Environmental Protection Agency, under a so-called liberal Democrat, would not enforce their own laws around the environmental hazards that people were pointing out. So we clearly understood like that, you know, part of a two-pronged approach to the fight against Cop City was to point out that this forest and the devastation of the forest was something that would impact the larger black community that was sitting right next to it. But we were always clear, no matter where Cop City was built, we were going to be opposed to it, right? So I just want to be clear on that part. But the fact that we're also destroying forests, that it would have large-scale environmental degradation, that it could cause additional flooding to happen in that community, the loss thereof of the use of the forest for that larger community, the history, again, that you mentioned, the Walani community, the indigenous people who were the Muskogee folks, I should say, who were part of that community, you know, part of that history is them being pushed off of that land. And a lot of those folks, a lot of them came back to participate in some of the Cop City struggle. And part of the larger struggle was hoping that folks would come back and even try to reclaim the land in terms of ancient burial grounds and so forth. So that was stuff that we understood to be at play. But knowing that the environmental degradation would add a certain impact to it. But again, wherever Cop City was going to be built, we were going to be opposed to it.
Of course, yeah, no, that was definitely up in the book, and I think we're a very strong part of the strategy. Okay, we're going to move into a media piece, because the Atlanta Community Press Collective, or ACPC, is an abolitionist, not-for-profit media collective, right? And since 2021, it's been at the forefront of investigative reporting on the Cop City project. So I have kind of a two-part question to this. First off, why was it necessary to create ACPC? What did you learn from successes and growth of that organization? And then as the second part, how does that work? How does work on media narrative connect to other left media projects like Black Liberation Media, formerly Black Power Media, which you're a founder of, especially in comparison to the wider Black targeted political media ecosystem, which is decidedly more liberal?
Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of the Atlanta Press Collective, one of the important things is that early on, the struggle did a great job in controlling and or creating some alternative narrative space, right? So even dubbing it Cop City was something that worked really well because nobody remembered the actual name of the site. Everybody referred to it as Cop City. Even the elected officials would slip and call it Cop City. So that was really cool because that was something that would happen. But all of the local media, including the Cox Foundation or the Cox company, which controlled the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, thank you for that, was for Cop City. In fact, Cox Enterprises gave millions of dollars and tried, again, not to expose the fact that they were overtly for this institution being built. They tried to hide that. They wouldn't say it in their 9 or 10 editorials that they wrote that was for the building of Cop City. Local media in terms of TV stations, right, in terms of how they portrayed things, they were for Cop City. National media, even when it would come in, particularly again after the forest was raided and Tortuguita was killed, their grand narrative was something that was for Cop City. So for us, it was important to have not only alternative media in terms of social media, but to have a actual media outlet. And the Atlanta Press Collective wasn't the only one, but they became the mainstay. They also did open records requests. They got information released that served the larger interests of the movement. Right? So they went on the attack by saying, look, we got these documents that show that the Atlanta Police Foundation was having secret meetings with the Atlanta Police Department. They were having secret meetings with the Georgia police. They were having secret meetings with the FBI. And all of these meetings were around how do we do things to control the movement and to criminalize the movement, right? We found that out because ACPC did open records requests. We found out really for the first time that these domestic terrorism charges were going to come down the pike because of work that Atlanta Community Press Collective did. So having alternative media, having Black liberation media echo this stuff in the larger Black community, particularly the activist or organizer Black community, allowed us to get messages out to the larger community that we probably could not have done on our own. The social media aspects of having different organizations and collectives talk about and echo the work of other folks that were doing work on Cop City helped us get a national audience around this. And helped us sort of beat back the narrative, again, as mentioned earlier, either outside agitators, violent demonstrators, the cops need a training center. All of this was like, this was in a funny way, it's like a war strategy, right? The state, the private actors had their strategy. Organizers and activists who don't have those resources as the state have to develop mechanisms and means to reach everyday people. So not only was the media work or narrative work online, but it was on the ground in terms of going into communities and handing out materials and getting people to sign up and find out what Cop City was. All of that was part of the work to sort of beat back a narrative in which the state was trying to employ. I'll say lastly on this, one of the ways in which we knew, again, that the narrative was successful, and one of the reasons why it was clear that they would never allow us to have a referendum, was because when we did internal polls, we saw the shifting, particularly in the Black community, on not supporting the idea of this training center, right? We always had a plurality, right? There's a plurality of interest, plurality in terms of the popular idea of the population deciding to be for or against it. The larger white population was always 80 or 90% for Cop City. The Black population, which again makes up well over 48% of the population of Atlanta, we got like 54 to 55% who were against it, right? Which was a big difference when when we first started, when polls showed it was more evenly split around 48 to 47%. Having a black mayor who would do press conferences, and he had one major press conference where he pulled out, again, the Black bourgeoisie. He pulled out the Black business class, and every former Black mayor, almost every Black city council person. They literally wheeled out Andy Young to all say that they were for Cop City. So the media work that was done, both intentional, haphazard. Oh, and I should also say, when the Black college students at Georgia State, at Spelman, at Morehouse began to come out against Cop City, that was also a major development in terms of the narrative, because that became a scary point for the city when the students started organizing. And at one point, the students started organizing, and they immediately tried to do an event on campus. And one of the things that went viral was they tried to do an event. The mayor himself went, and a student yelled out from the audience and called him a sellout. And he tried to say, I'm not a sellout. You gonna call me a sellout? That clip went viral for us, right? And that again became something which helped us with the larger narrative, particularly in the Black community, around the purpose of Cop City and what the meaning of Cop City was.
No, thank you. That's helpful. Okay, I'm gonna again combine a couple questions. So you've already kind of highlighted this, a bit of a local connection. There's a local, national, and global connections that I want to highlight, and I'll go through that in just a little bit. But first, abolitionists Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Craig Gilmore describe in the book organized abandonment as profound austerity and the iron fist necessary to impose it. So we can see that in Cop City, obviously, but we can see that here in DC as well, which we're experiencing again under Black Democratic leadership. City leadership has passed a crime bill recently. They've instituted youth curfews, carrying out massive cuts to the public sector, including Medicaid and Medicare. And also, this is one of the most heavily policed cities in the country, with numerous different police agencies. So that's the local. Nationally, cop cities are literally being developed all over the country, with one estimate putting the number at 69 facilities. Those include facilities like the $330 million compound in Baltimore, Maryland. And then finally, there's the international connections, right? There's a program called the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, popularly known as GILI, housed in Georgia State University's Andrew Young School of Public Policy Studies, which is crazy. GILI trains thousands of U.S. and Israeli police on topics like border policing, urban policing, and drug interdiction. There's substantial evidence that shows GILI teaches racial profiling, mass surveillance, arbitrary detention, and brutal violence against protesters. When the Georgia State Patrol's, while the Georgia State Patrol's murder of Tortuguita marked the first known instance of state forces killing an environmental protester in the United States, the killing of land defenders is heartbreakingly common in South and Central America. And then finally, in El Salvador, in El Salvador's case, right, obviously the regime behind Bukele, or led by Bukele, they've opened the terrorist confinement center, which is claimed to be the largest in the world. And they've arrested not only anti-mining activists, but also union leaders, youth organizers, and political opponents. And just for the record, right, this is the same prison, CCOT, where people are being snatched up here and being sent to. This is the same facility. So can you just speak a little bit about these local, national, international connections, and particularly talk about U.S. imperialism, the imperial boomerang, go on from there.
Yeah. So I think, as stated earlier, Western policing, the role of Western police and military apparatus is clear, right? It is to keep down oppressed classes. It is to take land. It is to oppress people. It is to take resources. I don't care where they're at in the world. That is their common objective. And part of the Cop City strategy is to how do they work closer together. The U.S. is the lead in that. So even though there's connections, the obvious connections between what they learn from each other, right? What the Israeli police or IDF learn from the U.S. and what the U.S., when I talked about the surveillance system in Atlanta, part of that surveillance system in terms of why it was developed was because Atlanta police went to Israel, saw the surveillance system in Jerusalem that was monitoring and controlling Palestinians. This is prior to the current uprising in terms of October, the current genocide, I should say, after October 7th, and decided that they wanted something like that here, right? So all of these surveillance systems are connected in terms of what Western military dominance wants around the world. However, to be very, very clear, the United States is the head of that, right? Israel is not the head of that. None of these South American nations are the head of that. Even in Europe, they're not the head of the snake, right? The head of the snake is the United States. The United States doesn't need to be trained by anybody on how to murder its own citizens, how to surveil people, how to kill people, how to jail people. In fact, most other nation states, right, including Nazi Germany, learned a lot of its work from looking at the Deep South and American policing and American military. So I say that to say that this combined interest that these Western European countries have obviously is about imperialism, but the lead or head of the snake, even as they're having some problems right now because the current head of the snake is a little different from what they're used to, the imperial core remains the same, even with some of the issues at this particular stage. It is controlling resources, it's controlling people, it's controlling spaces, it's controlling land. That is the imperial project. How do we make capitalism work as efficiently as possible by controlling these things? These cop cities which are developing are basically military bases that are domesticated for the use of the police. These large training areas, these militarized equipment, some of this equipment that they get directly from the military, it is meant to make these policing agencies stronger than ever. Look at ICE right now, right? ICE, in terms of these raids, it looks like military operations, not policing operations, military operations. When you look at the equipment that they're using, when you look at their tactics and their strategies, These are military operations that are taking place. And so the militarization of domestic police forces, again, it is a collaborative effort by Western nation states to better control populations as capitalism begins to, I'm not sure if I like the word fail, because it's always been designed to not do anything for working class and poor people. But some of it is failing worse than what it's used to. And as there's more uprisings or reasons in which the general population is harder to control, right? Here in the United States, there's never been much of a so-called social safety net or welfare system to begin with. Europe is far more used to it, but as they ply away and take some other way, folks are doing or are engaging again in more uprisings themselves. And then again, we're places where you have Israel, which are basically European outposts for control in other land masses. All of these things, these systems, are trying to keep themselves going, not by propaganda as a lead force anymore, but by direct military rule. And so when we look at the interconnectedness between cop cities and U.S. imperialism or Western imperialism, we have to look at it as a furtherance of a strategy which has already been in place. The cops being militarized is not new. The extent of it and the ways in which the tactics are being used are an upgrade, right? When I talk to people from the BLA or the Black Liberation Army or the Panthers from the 60s and 70s, they say that they feel the conditions today are much worse than what they were fighting 40 or 50 years ago in terms of the level of repression. Like, they used to be able to break out of prisons. It's like we couldn't do that today in these supermaxes, not the way in which things are operating. So they actually see a system which they see as hardening and trying to take more control. Some people may say the system is in its death throes. I'm not quite sure about that. I think the system may be weaker in some ways because its economic instability and its further ability or further desire to really suck wealth to the billionaire class is unprecedented. And I think part of that is leading to the idea of we don't need the propaganda as much anymore. We can resort to overt violence mixed with propaganda. And I think that's a lot of the sort of least the ideological ways in which the cop city idea is about militarizing the police the way that the military has already been militarized, or using the police the way the military is used all over the world.
Thank you. Okay, I got another big sandwich question for you. This one's more about state repression and counterinsurgency. Throughout the movement, Stop Cop City organizers and activists have experienced intense repression, including domestic terrorism charges, as you mentioned, a 61-person RICO. Oh, those domestic terrorism charges were signed by a black judge, which is important to note. 61-person RICO conspiracy indictment, which attempts to criminalize building blocks of leftist organizing like mutual aid and like zines. Of course, the tragic murder of Manuel Tortuguita Terán, which you mentioned. So we see this kind of broad ecosystem of domestic terrorism. There's also this element of counterinsurgency. The U.S. Army defines counterinsurgency warfare as military, paramilitary, political, economic, psychological, and civic actions taken by a government to defeat insurgency. Right, so we can see that playing out as well. And then for the last part, I just want to put this in conversation with Burton's text, Tip of the Spear. Because in Tip of the Spear, he talks about 4 strategies of reformist counterinsurgency, and I couldn't help but, as I was reading the book, see them at play. Those 4 strategies are expansion, humanization, diversification, and programification. I'm going to focus on expansion and humanization. Expansion is the indispensable necessity of the prison industrial complex. It is a reformist imperative that accepts the permanence of prison as a given and sees its progression as the only viable option. Humanization, as you would expect, is really about supposedly making the system more amenable to the dignity of the human being. We can see both of these trajectories or strategies within the Atlanta prison farm. Sorry, I lost myself. But the Atlanta prison farm, over the course of its history, had multiple complaints of abuse, medical neglect, etc., to the point where even officials at Grady Memorial Hospital suggested hiring out medical staffs because it would generate $125,000 in profit. So as another way for them to make money. In fact, the noxious living conditions at the farm persisted until its closure and against a steady drumbeat of reassurances that expansion would alleviate human suffering. J.D. Hudson, the superintendent of the prison farm in its last years, was hyped by the press, including Atlanta Journal-Constitution, as a humanitarian reformer. He described the previous conditions as slave labor, but he also said that detained people are, quote, ridden with guilt about their lives. They want to be mistreated and abused, and they want to be denigrated in some sort of atonement for their sins. He bragged frequently of his intention to give people incarcerated at the prison farm a measure of self-respect so that they could lead decent lives again. So this is like a broad kind of question, but how do you see expansion and humanization at play as elements of counterinsurgency, as elements of the broader oppression that the Cop City movement was experiencing?
So, as you were talking, and I'm staring at this picture, right? This depiction of an African who was whipped so much under slavery that these scars are the scars that's on their back. And as we know, or as we should know, prior to 1865, there was hardly any Africans in prison. And why was that? Because we were all on the plantation. 1865 to 1872, the black population in prison went from nearly 0 to over 30%, right? And why is that? Because that was the place where they can reincarcerate us for either making us go back on the plantation and controlling our population. Since 1865, the prison industrial complex, as it's been built out, and obviously it started off slowly and reached a certain capacity in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, has always been a place to relocate African people in this country, both for excess population reasons in terms of like excess labor, let's get these folks off the street, and for having a potential workforce in prison. Now, the prison workforce, again, some people may argue about this when I get to the humanity part, but it's never been a strong point of capitalist development, to be honest, right? Nor has the prison or the private prison industry been a huge place where capitalists are making so much money. Prisons serve as a place, in terms of speaking of Ori, a place of oppression and surveillance and taking so-called dangerous black folks off the street who might rebel. That's political people, and that's folks in neighborhoods who, because they're not involved in the labor market, have excess time and may get the wrong ideas, and let's get them off the streets as fast as possible. So prisons are not about criminality, obviously. They're about oppression. But people have to be convinced that we need these prisons and we need to arrest people, and people need to understand that they are in these prisons because they've done wrong. And so that's where you get the narrative arc of prisons are for safety. People who are in prisons are there to be rehabilitated. People who are in prisons often feel very terrible about things that they're in prison for, and so therefore we're serving some larger good by having them there. In fact, some of it can be directly related back to slavery in terms of the happy slave narrative, right? Or the enslaved person who should be content with where they are. And black folks, they're not upset. Don't stir the pot. Don't be coming in here and saying these folks are upset to be in these conditions. They love these conditions. They can't be happier. Jim Crow was a place of like saying people are happy in our situation or our conditions. And again, these outside agitators from the north or from wherever or from different cities are stirring up our local populations who like the treatment that they're getting, right? That's where that's the narrative generation comes from, these past conditions, and the focal point of the logical place for them to be housed is now saying that the prisoners are happy to be prisoners, get something out of being in prison. And of course, you get a few people who will tell you prison allowed this to happen or allowed that to happen. And then that becomes the generative story of a sort of similar of a Horatio Alger story around raising yourself up from bootstraps in terms of capitalist narrative, right? So these folks who control these prisons, whether they are working class people themselves, they also want to feel good about themselves. And so their narrative is that they're doing some good for society. Oh my God, these people are so dangerous, and without us here, these dangerous people will be let out back into the streets. So you have this sort of narrative that is consistent, not only doing enslavement, not only doing oppressive Jim Crow, but naturally take place in terms of what happens with the prison population. You didn't ask this directly, criminalization of movement obviously is not new. It goes back in time to any uprising, right, of our history. We don't get taught about the uprisings that took place, even the ones that we know, the most famous ones about Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, so forth and so on. We hear bits and pieces about that, but those people aren't lifted up as our heroes. We're not told that those are like the heroes of our people because of the work that they did in terms of breaking out of enslavement, right? White folks lift up the so-called Revolutionary War as heroes. Our folks fight back against oppression, and they're called crazy, dangerous, terrorists, criminals, insurgents, and they're literally murdered by the state for that, right? And that history goes through. Obviously, people know about COINTELPRO. All the stuff that's happening now in terms of the Cop City defendants are tried and true measures that have been used before on not only black radicals, but white radicals, Latino radicals, Mexican radicals, any radical, right? It is the criminalization of movement. And so the reason they introduced domestic terrorism charges and racketeering charges is because they want the general population to be scared of organizers, to be scared of people who will say that this is an oppressive state and then use the appropriate tactics and strategies to try to free themselves from that oppression. People who won't just march in the street and go home, as you know, famous quotes from Dr. King, they won't, not Dr. King, from Malcolm X, they won't show up when they're told to show up, go home when they're told to go home, say the words that they're said to say, and then that's the end of it. Ooh, we did a good job, that march is over, right? Folks were doing more than that. And so they had to make sure that this doesn't become part of the common consciousness of everyday people who also already know how to rebel, to be honest, but who we, a lot of times, again, to be honest, want them to rebel in a systemic way as opposed to the rebellions that take place after some incident happens, right? They're scared that an organized people will rebel when they're ready to rebel, not strictly because some incident takes place that causes people to rebel. When you look at the indictment of the RICO charges in particular, the state of Georgia, that's where the indictment comes from. But I want to be clear too, there's been a joint task force of, again, Atlanta Police, DeKalb County Police, which Atlanta is part of, Fulton County Police, which Atlanta is part of, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which is the state police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation under Joe Biden, Homeland Security under Joe Biden, had a task force that all collabed with the Atlanta Police Foundation in thinking through the charges to criminalize movements. The indictment for against the organizers, the RICO indictment, says the beginning of the criminal case or the criminal enterprise did not start when we were organizing against Cop City. It started the day that George Floyd was murdered. That was where they traced their indictment of the so-called Cop City defendants. What does that tell you? That tells you that that was a year and a half before there was any action on Cop City, before we even knew there was a Cop City. That indictment says that for the state, the criminal enterprise started when people came out of their homes to protest and to organize against the murder of George Floyd by the police. That was when a criminal enterprise was born for them. They say in their own documents. So when we look at the criminalization of organizers and activists and how that ties to prison, any act of rebellion is a criminal act, right? And so you must understand that when you are an organizer and activist, right? You're going against a repressive state. That is your job. That is your work. And when the state represses, to be honest, that is their job. That is their work. Small reforms will never do the job. They might win some small victories, which we need to do. Overall, the state is operating the way it was designed to operate, which is the repression of oppressed people. And oppressed people have a right to rebel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. You're reminding me that I think I can't remember if it was an essay called that, but Ruthie Gilmore definitely said, like, you can't reform a war away, right? So I think that, speaks to what you're saying. Okay, as we close up, or at least close this portion, I want to get to where we are today, right? Where we are today is Cop City, unfortunately, has been opened. They call it the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. That's what they call it. But it opened on Tuesday, April 29th, 2025. So given this, what can we learn from the Stop Cop City movement? Where does it go in terms of its mission, objectives, strategies, and tactics? And that's the question. What can we learn, and where is it going? Where is that movement going?
I mean, I think I take a little bit of a controversial stance now on the Cop City movement, right? I don't think there no longer is a Cop City movement, and nor should there be. I think there are lessons to learn from this book or talking to people about the work that was done in terms of decentralized movement. And it doesn't mean that works in every movement. It means that for this particular movement, it was something that was useful. But the Cop City movement was a battle. It was not the war. And there are lessons to be learned, but you can't duplicate something over and over again. So even if there's places where Cop Cities are being built, there may be a local movement that springs up against it, but maybe not. As organizers and activists, one of the things that we have to come out of as radicals or revolutionaries, one of the things that has to come out of the understanding of the Cop City movement, again, a critique is that it never built to mass scale. It never got to, and that's a critique of my organization, Community Movement Builders, that's a critique of all of us. We were never able to pull people out in mass numbers. It was central, at its essence, it was a campaign directed by organizers. In and of itself, not bad, but not a mass movement. The not bad part speaks to, that means that we can create movement wherever we are. And scaling that movement will a lot of times be up to us in terms of how good we are at base building and bringing that out community. And that is the role of a radical revolutionary organizer anyway. You're supposed to be bringing out our community, right? That's our job. But also part of our job is to create movement moments. We created a movement moment with Cop City. It doesn't mean we need to duplicate Cop City. Wherever we are, we need to find what are those new movement moments that we need to create. Mobilizations will always take place. There's always going to be something that happens sooner or later which will spark the masses into the streets. Organizations need to be there to support that and to develop folks so that they don't continue just to go back in their homes 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, but that they join movement, they join organizations. However, it is also a responsibility of movement people, of organizations, of activists, of revolutionaries, of radicals, to develop strategies and plans where they start to begin to make the movement happen out of things that you never thought would be a movement. We didn't know that by starting off demonstrations in town halls, that this movement would continue to grow, right? That wasn't the idea. You never know these things. You could do 1,000 marches and demonstrations and you're like, 8 people showed up that day. And you're like, okay, we're gonna move on to something else, right? Or 10 people the next day. Or you do something like this and 15 people show up at a town hall meeting. You don't necessarily know. But there was a certain element of planning, of collective, look, we all should throw down on this. So the idea, again, George Jackson, of settling your quarrels, right? Because fascism is already here. Our individual organizations are not big enough. We have to stop the infighting. We have to work with people that we're not necessarily always or completely politically aligned with. In fact, again, as radicals or revolutionaries, as organizers, if you work in a community, you certainly will not be believing the same things as everybody in the community believes. But your job is to be working with those folks. Your job is to work with different organizations and activists who have some semblance of politics which are similar, but will not be exact. And so what are the things that you can work on, right? What are the popular things that you can do to try to build mass movement? That is the lesson of a Cop City in the modern era. is that organizers can spark movement action, as we've done before Cop City, of course. As folks have done, or I think that's more of a mobilization post the Palestine stuff, but people created the encampments, which were unexpected, right? And unexpected for these college takeovers to take place. The question for movement is, what do we do to mobilize people and mobilize ourselves to create the next big thing that might get further than what we got on Cop City? Because if you block something, then you can actually show the power of the people, right? We just have lessons, good lessons. But the next movement might be able to block something that we were not able to block. They may be able to stop a prison from being built, to stop a jail from being built, to defeat an ICE from taking over a community, right? All of that is in our hands. And so for me, the lesson of Cop City, or the what's next, is not to rebuild a national Cop City movement, although I know, again, I participate in some of those actions. It is, what is the next thing that's either local or regional or even national that sparks enough interest for folks to gather together and work together and to make some serious plans around how we organize in the streets. So that, for me, is the biggest lesson. It can be done. We've shown it can be done over and over again. Cop City fits into a certain trajectory of modern times in which we've done that, but it won't be the last time, and the next time will be bigger, and the next time might be in the city in D.C. where we're at right now. So, you know, march on.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, no, please give him a hand. Give him a hand. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your work, and thank you for this book, this text. As you said, it's lots of lessons in there. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of the program. But before we do that, I do want to call out, I'm here in my capacity as a member of Sankofa, but also I'm an organizer with Black Alliance for Peace and with Pan-African Community Action. Both of those organizations are here tonight. Can y'all raise your hand, please, so people can find y'all? We have literature, they can tell you about our campaigns, what we're working on, all of which is connected to this work, and you can get a local taste of that. So from there, we'll move into the open Q&A, and you can take any questions.
Peace. My name is Johannes, a member of Black Alliance for Peace and the DC Citywide Alliance, and a member of Pan-African Community Action, a community-based organization organizing for power in Southeast DC. Thank you for your contribution, as well as all your contributions via formerly Black Power Media and currently Black Liberation Media. Big listener there. Earlier, you spoke to a principle of sort of like public support as a tactic. So everyone in the various movements in this coalition, everyone's agreeing we're not going to publicly criticize, but then obviously behind the scenes you're going to hash it out and sort of come to resolutions. I was wondering what you would sort of, I guess, term that principle, and then thinking about it sort of as a tactic that was employed, how would you assess its effectiveness? I understand the case study of you had a week of demonstrations that everyone was in on, and then the Molotov incident, or the incident happened where there was Molotovs there. Looking back, not just then, but then through to the end of this particular part of the struggle in Atlanta, how would you sort of, I guess, sum it up, lessons that others could take away from that tactic in particular? Yeah, that's.
I think. So it was obviously a decentralized movement. There were folks, like myself, who served as a connector to different parts of the movement. But early on, we didn't have grand meetings or big meetings in terms of, you said the word coalition. So in some ways, we didn't necessarily see it as a coalition. But we never wrote out our principles of that this would not be what we would do. Some of it, I think, we took from the prior struggles where we saw, well, everybody saw, right? Where prior struggles, again, the media divided movements on who was a good organizer and who was a bad organizer. And the bad organizer were the folks who, again, were not getting permits. They were not marching at a certain time. They would take the streets. Again, some window might get busted. Those were bad organizers who were stepping outside the bounds of what would be considered nonviolent, peaceful protest. I cringe every time I hear that word, right? Every those words put together. Anytime someone writes on a flyer that they're engaged in nonviolent protests, I'm like, what the fuck? Excuse my French. Because it's, I don't have to prove to you that I'm going to be nonviolent or I'm going to be whatever. That's not my role, right? But again, the movement ethos, and part of the system, some of it is the nonprofitization of movement, some of it is sort of the historical entanglements between a civil rights movement and a Black Power movement, particularly in our communities, that there's a struggle on how you conduct a movement. So for us, knowing that there were different elements, and I think some of this comes out of more the anarchist tradition, knowing that we were different elements, that people were going to be engaged in different types of tactics, the early ideas that spread across the movement was an understanding. It was like, look, some of us are going to be doing this type of work. And we understand that you may not be doing that again, but we cannot have a division of that work. And again, there might be some coalitions where you formally state that, right? And that these days it might even be necessary. But we had a clear understanding that we would not sell out fellow organizers because they engaged in tactics which were more militant than some of us either wanted to do, would do, were scared to do, whatever it was. Lastly, I would also say on this issue is, I think within the recent Black tradition, even amongst Black radicals, there's been a de-emphasizing of more radical tactics. And some of the excuses, and I call them excuses, that we use is like, you see what they're doing to white boys, imagine what they're going to do to us, right? Or people will say things like, I'm not going to sit down and be peacefully taken in by the police, like they're going to do something big if that happens, or they like, we should be doing this, or we should be gun training and all the rest of it. That may be cool to get that gun training, but most people ain't, using that kind of thing for nothing, right? So it's almost like a recreational activity. So one of the things that we have to reconcile within our movement, I'm not telling people to do things which they are not prepared to do, but the idea of civil disobedience and direct action has a long tradition. Even the more peaceful versions of it of a Dr. King, it's still a more direct confrontation, and some of us are willing to do these days because we have rationales about not wanting to be arrested, not wanting to be handled by the police. There are other groups right now that are like, we're taking some chances. And I'm talking about, chances which are planned out. Mass mobilizations or mass actions or responses to police violence will always lead to certain kinds of uprisings and stuff like that. But from the organized class of people, we have lowered the temperature we're willing to put on society. Let me put it that way. To do safer demonstrations and to use safer tactics, even if we have radical rhetoric, right? To reconcile that, at the very least, we have to not sell out, other folks who are willing to do more. And I think within our community, there's a little bit of controversy. I think even Fred Hampton at one point sort of chastised, way back, of course, in the day, chastised anarchists for doing certain things that look to be adventurous. And sometimes people can do adventurous things that you're like, what the hell is that, right? But in general, the idea would be those discussions around what is adventurous or what we think is good for movement should take place amongst movement. But there should be, maybe the best way to say this is a unified front, that our role is not to do the job of the state, to separate organizers and activists, and even to help them criminalize certain sections of organizers and activists by saying we think those tactics are wrong, and therefore them using some soundbite of ours as a way of showing that it's okay to arrest these people and not other people. All my answers are that long.
Hi. I have a certain take on these movements. I think that a mistake that's been made is that there's been too much emphasis on ideology and not outcomes. And the fact that people are bickering within these groups over the slightest ideological differences and they don't come to an agreement on, okay, what are we trying to actually achieve? Now, one of the things that was coming out of the 60s, when I was a child of, it was a Black Power movement, and you never hear the word Black Power anymore. One of the things that was lost is the fact that while you're doing all this other stuff, you should be attempting to be in the positions of power so you can make the decisions and not always going to be reacting to somebody else's decisions. Charlie Lamont did that when they took over Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of Mississippi, and he got on the city council, and then they got more people in the city council. Then he became mayor, and now his son is mayor. So one of the things that I think needs to be done is there needs to be a de-emphasis, because I've been to so many meetings where people bicker over ideology. There should be a de-emphasis on ideology and more of an emphasis on specific things that you want to do. Because there are many people who are not into your ideology that would agree on getting certain specific things done. Now, Mondani in New York proved that because he ran on economic labor type issues, and the fact that they had ranked choice voting in New York pushed them over. In DC, which has a regressive mayor and city council in many ways, we just voted to initiate ranked choice voting in DC. It passed the first budget hearing to get funded and has one more to go. So I think if we actually look strategically and become more sophisticated politically and not just see ourselves as reactors and protesters, but potential deciders of what does or doesn't get done in this country, then we can change whatever we want to change because we have the numbers. But the right wing has the plan. They know exactly what they want to do, and they stick to it, and they bicker, but they will go in there and sign that bill, and we don't have nowhere near that discipline consensus on what those things should be. And I think that needs to be improved, because we're not going to beat them with guns and weapons. We're going to beat them with being in those positions and just outing them out of place, and they won't have any opportunity to stop that once you get into positions and you control the police and you control the army and you control everything else. And until you do that, you're always going to be on the outside complaining about what they do because you don't have the infrastructural capacity to challenge them.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And just want to make a note, we can just keep our questions a little bit shorter just so we can make sure more people get a chance. But yeah, thank you. Kamau, go ahead.
Oh, and I lied, so this is going to be a long answer. So I agree with you, as I stated. The part that I do agree with you is that I think we have too many fights about political ideology when we're not in a position to even enact our political ideology. That I agree with. Well, here's where I disagree with you, probably more in total. Ideology is extremely important because ideology is a guide that lets you know why you're doing your actions, obviously, and what you hope to accomplish through your actions. Because without an ideology, you will do anything and think you're winning, right? Ideology may not be something which you perfectly implement, but it is a guide to your actions. You seem to be hinting at electoral politics. So you spoke about the Jackson Plan. I was a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, someone who helped write the Jackson Plan, and I was Chokwe Lumumba Sr.'s first campaign manager in Jackson, Mississippi. Our plan was a plan to take over Jackson, not strictly through electoral politics. It was a plan around taking over Jackson in terms of land, resources, cooperatives, building infrastructure outside the system, as well as trying to take over the system. Parts of the Jackson Plan failed because we failed to use our ideology as a guide. We got into an office, but we did not use our ideology as enough of a guide to keep us from thinking too much that that office itself held all the power. So what I mean by that is, like, once the office was won, all of the work, or too much of the work, went into the electoral project, as opposed to the base building, which was supposed to have driven the work in the first place, right? So and today, what we have, Chokwe Jr. is no longer the mayor of Jackson, right? The new mayor of Jackson is a favorite of the right wing, right? He is not somebody and so Chokwe Jr. was defeated, and there's various reasons why. But so part of the Jackson plan or part of the electoral system, I think my major disagreement is we're never going to be able to defeat America through the electoral system, because that system, where I disagree with you again, is that we don't have the numbers. The vast majority this is a white supremacist country. The white working class, maybe controversial for some, is not to be trusted. There are going to be offshoots of the white working class which will side on with us. But we have not shown within the history of this country, at least in my reading of the country, that when the chips are down, the white working class helps the black working class. It doesn't come to the side of the black working class. It comes to the side of white supremacy. And you look at any vote that's been taking place in this country through the electoral process, even during the Great Recession when Obama won the White House, do you know where the majority of white folks voted? They voted for the Republican, right? The vast majority of white folks continue to vote for the overt white supremacist candidate, not the covert white supremacist candidate, right? So why take their white supremacy light when they can have the hardcore version is basically what they do. So I think there's things to get out of the electoral system, right? But I don't think that's our main thrust of strategy. We have to be able to build alternatives as we've challenged the state. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive at all, right? So I'm coming back to maybe some point of an agreement. I think there are ways in which we challenge the state, both electorally, both with campaign work, but I also think we have to base build. We have to be able to create things in our own community that acts as alternatives and models of autonomy and to a liberated territory. The organizations in black community and radical black history which have gained the most black followers have been those which have been able to build models of what it looks like for black life outside of white control. Again, not completely marooning ourselves into thinking that we're going to build these institutions and white supremacy is just going to allow us to build them. Either way, there's a fight. And it may not be a fight right now with guns and weapons and all the rest of it. I by no means am I delusional enough to think that we're going to defeat America through that. But there's going to be a fight. And it's not going to be an electoral fight. So unless the community is organized, unless the community has alternative ways in which it's going to feed itself, which is going to house itself, which is going to make decisions outside of the electoral base that we have, without that, there is no struggle. And even Dr. King recognized that by the end of his life, right? Dr. King was saying that this was a house burning. Dr. King was saying maybe he was wrong in leading us into thinking that we should be integrating into a system or integrating into a burning house, right? The person that they push to us as the most moderate figure that we should be following, they bastardize his politics. Dr. King was talking about America as the most violent country in the world. So these institutions were not built for reform to allow an equality of space, time, resources. They're capitalist institutions. The whole purpose is to hoard wealth. So I don't disagree that the electoral system has a role to play, but it is never our major role in my humble estimation. It is a part of a struggle, but it is not the place where, particularly again, organizers in the street need to be organizing communities for community control, for control over resources, for control over blocks. We need community control. That is how we win. That is the basis of us winning.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have another question?
Peace. My name is Kai with Black Alliance for Peace and Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. Evan, I appreciated your mention earlier when you brought up BAP. I know that on Black Alliance for Peace website, we have a map of U.S. militarization throughout the Americas. So it's looking at what that looks like locally in the U.S., but also throughout different regions. And the reason why I bring that up, I guess a question for both Kamau as well as for Evan, to the extent that you can answer it, is for Kamau, like there's been different abolitionists or folks who have termed themselves as abolitionists at some point, like a Ruthie Wilson Gilmore or Sami Burton, or maybe think about Dylan Rodriguez, who also have maybe moved beyond or don't use the same connotation of the word abolition and abolitionism that is used currently. Could you talk about just making the importance of why it's important to make the distinction or maybe the limitations of abolition that doesn't take into consideration an internationalist lens that maybe just looks very local to policing without tying the cop city to the cop world aspect that you're talking about? And for Evan, if you could answer maybe after that about what that looks like in terms of looking at internal colonies locally and the fight for community control, and how you see that also at that same international lens as well.
So really quickly, so yeah, I don't refer to myself as an abolitionist, not that I'm opposed to abolition. Traditionally, abolition has been very revolutionary. George Jackson considered himself an abolitionist, right? I think part of what's happening with abolition today is that it's a piecemeal, it's been taken on as a piecemeal approach, or at least some of the rhetoric thereof, right? I don't think it necessarily always people mean this, but when people say we're going to, again, abolish the police or abolish prisons, unless they're really talking about it is the state itself that needs to be confronted, because the state has these tools for certain reasons. The state is not going to let you close down all the prisons. The state is not going to let you abolish police and have alternatives to police, because that is what the state relies on for the incarceration of people and for the control of communities. And so when I hear abolitionists sort of sectioning off the ways in which we need to battle the state, that's what gets me a little confused, or a little bit like, well, let's just be careful with the rhetoric. I think some of the rhetoric obviously is good public rhetoric, like when you talk about abolishing the police, and again, what happened out of the 2020 uprisings and maybe before, it gave a certain conversation that we didn't have before in terms of a mainstream conversation that I think was having some, having some impact along sort of a mainstream conversation around policing. And I thought that was a good thing. But when people take that to be not the tactic, but an actual way in which they're going to implement, I think it's a mistake, because then it's taking away from it's not understanding or recognizing, again, what the state is, the role of the state, the role of capitalism, the role of white supremacy. These things are not incidents or things that they didn't consider. These are the heart of how they use their systems of control to control all of us, and they're not giving that up. Lastly, people talk about, this is not the same question, but it just popped up because of the other thing. If you took over the Democratic Party, if we talk about electoral politics, if radicals took over the Democratic Party, do you know what would happen with the Democratic Party? All the billionaires would leave and start a new party, right? So there's no such thing of really stopping prisons without focusing on who's controlling the prisons, who's controlling the police, and why they're here in the first place. And that's my maybe slight ideological dissenting view around how abolition is used today. I'm sure when you talk to some abolitionists, they'll say, no, we mean more than that. But again, some of what I hear makes me think too much that they're thinking we're going to be able to take out these sections of it. And I think it's a larger fight than that.
Yeah, I would holistically agree with everything that Kamau said. I think I would only add, just to your comment around domestic colonialism, right, that all of these things are a part of one continuum of violence, right, whether it be colonialism, domestic colonialism, or imperialism. And as Kamau, alluded to, right, we can't abolish any prison system without directly addressing the state, without directly addressing imperialism in and of itself. So those things are connected. In PACA, we often say that we're not looking for, we're looking for power. We're working for power. And one of our tools of analysis is that Black people operate as a domestic colony. So we can see that here in DC in the way in which the Black community is segregated, in this very city, right? If we look at something like Ward 7, Ward 8, the life expectancy is about 71 years. When we move over to wealthy, more affluent white parts of the city, life expectancy jumps to 85 years, right? That's within the same city. When we think about the deprivation of, the not food deserts, but the food apartheid, where people on the east side of the Anacostia River don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, grocery stores, medical, a hospital or medical facilities, right? Like that's all a part of this. And, quite simply, you can't abolish what you don't control, right? If we want to get rid of the police, we want to get rid of prisons, we need to control those things, and then we can decide what to do with them. I think that's all I would add.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Lydia. I'm an organizer with the Malcolm X grassroots movement. I have a question on looking at COINTELPRO, this new age of surveillance and the political prisoners that were birthed out of the Cop City movement. What was the security strategy and culture that you implemented, especially in this kind of broad-based campaign?
I would say some of the security mechanisms was because it was decentralized. We didn't have large-scale meetings at first. Most of the meetings that took place were across sector, but not like everybody was in the same room at the same time. Some of the other security apparatus was how we started to have conversations with each other when we did start. So we did use Signal, not impenetrable, but as opposed to mass text on other devices. Signal became the use. When somebody would get arrested, all Signal chats, that person was cleared out, and those Signal chats were immediately squashed, right? We had, say this part delicately, we had our own tools of investigation of not necessarily who was coming into movement, but how people participated or acted in movement, right? Most of us were mass-based in certain ways, and so, as you know, mass-based, it's hard to regulate who comes in as much, right? Sometimes people do a little mixture of mass cadre, but pure mass, people are coming in. How you really know whether or not people, how you sort of judge people or watch people is mostly through how they conduct themselves and the work that they do, right? And so if someone is a so-called agent or provocateur, but they're doing the work, then they get left alone because you don't know that anyway and they're doing the work. Usually sometimes it's the provocateurs, whether they're agents or not agents, those are the folks who have to get watched, the people who are causing dissension or the people who are always having an argument or the people who are doing things that break up movement strategy. And again, not that principled struggle is not encouraged, but there are ways in which you try to watch that or watch and see what's happening. The different organizations at the early stages of Cop City had certain relationships with each other that had some longevity to them, even if they were organizers and activists from different formations. At some point when the forest defenders went into the forest, those folks acted in certain ways which were outside of the purview of folks like us who were outside the forest, right? And so in some ways keeping siloed some of your work so that it wouldn't have implications on other people's work. Those are some of the main things that come to mind around how we had a security, our security culture. But the weaknesses were that it was a mass movement, and so people could come in at different places. The weaknesses were that we live in a surveillance state, and so it's hardly ever something that you're going to do that's public, which is not in some way not going to get captured by, again, the surveillance cameras and the ways in which the facial recognition is done and all that kind of stuff. That stuff is hard to stop, right? We are now doing, I guess this last part on security culture, the protection of people who are now becoming, not necessarily, have not yet become political prisoners. I guess maybe it depends on how you design it. People who are have charges pending, which are now going to start facing trial in the later half of 2025 and part of 2026. How we're doing jail support and mass support for those folks is also part of security culture, because no one should ever be a part of movement when the people who get arrested or jailed, who are making those sacrifices, feel alone, right? And unfortunately, throughout our own history, whether New African or non-New African, sometimes we've had to rebuild from scratch the ways in which our political prisoners get support from us, because movement was completely destroyed and it had to be rebuilt in some ways to offer support, where folks for a long time felt left alone. So at least at this current iteration of it, there's a feeling of defense and support for folks, even bail at times when folks were arrested, but ways in which we're providing some sense of security because we're surrounding our folks with the kind of support they need to keep it going.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Testing. Hello. My name is DJ. I am an organizer for both PACA and Black Alliance for Peace. First, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to discuss your book as well as discuss the experiences you had through the Cop City movement. I really enjoyed the portion regarding how you utilize mass media, mass communications, because it affected the way that me and some of my friends back in undergrad, all the way in Central Illinois, first heard of the Cop City movement, as well as your work with Black Liberation Media, formerly Black Power Media. And it was because of that we were able to actually organize an event to
It's like the artist formerly known as Prince.
But because of the effective mass media campaign you had, we were able to inform all these students in this little mid-sized town, Central Illinois, about Cop City in Atlanta, but also to tell them what was going to happen in Baltimore, Maryland, as well as one close to us, which was in Chicago, which students constantly came from campus from and didn't even know that the former mayor, Lori Lightfoot, even established this. And so in focusing on the mass media question, I know you and Dr. Jared Ball have both talked about how Atlanta is propagated as Wakanda, this mecca of Black excellence and Black prosperity and Black capitalism, where you can just move down here and with the right connections and the right tools and the right marketing that you can prosper and become this Black bourgeoisie that you have always been advertised to be. And so the question that I had was that it was a quick set of two. How did Cop City activists compete against a pop culture landscape that continues to constantly be in bed with propaganda in the military entertainment complex, and where did you all see it the most apparent as you were continuing your activism?
I mean, all over the place. And I think you're completely correct. Like, so the propaganda, it's not a local issue. That's a national thing, right? That's a Hollywood thing. That's a political propaganda thing. So that's Democrat or Republican thing. That is the mainstay of how politics works in America, is that you must always support the police, and the police, even if there's rotten apples, the police are always there for good, right? And constantly you get the Black politicians, white politicians who will say, you know, we're going to look into something, but, you know, we got to make sure that we support our police. Even the idea, again, of Cop City, one of the early statements by Keisha Lance Bottoms, who was the mayor at the time, was that the reason for Cop City was to basically build up the self-esteem of the police. That was one of her chief reasons for why they needed to build Cop City, because he felt they were under attack with all this abolition talk and all these street demonstrations and the rest of it. So for us early, the propaganda thing was always part of that struggle. The other part of your question, which almost question, I think, that resonated with me when you mentioned sort of the Black elites, is the class war within the Black community. That is our biggest fight, right? Because the masses of Black folks still believe that the Black bourgeois work for the Black masses. We still believe in the Black first, the Black second, the Black third, the Black woman, the Black LGBTQ. We still believe in all of that. If we win a position in the system, we think these folks are working for us, as opposed to they've taken a job working for the state, which means they work for capitalist interests, right? And every so now and often you may get one or two, but that is not the vast majority of the role of the Black misleadership class or Black bourgeois class. They are the chief antagonists in this war, right? They are the ones who are convincing a critical, I won't say the majority, but a critical mass of our people to still believe that these electoral politics mean something. They themselves prop up the police. Obama was a continual propper up of the police and the military state. And so basically the arm of America, right? So that is one of the major battles that we have to continue to fight. one of the things that we as community movement builders served as, that we were the black organization in Atlanta at that time. Not because we were special, because the other ones had either fallen, or they weren't doing as much, or they just weren't on the front lines of this struggle. And that allowed us to play a particular role in terms of being in this struggle at that early stages of it. Later on, a lot of black organizations joined on, but at that early stage, we were the so-called radical black organization that was doing well enough that we could enter this struggle. We provided a counter-attack to the black bourgeois, which the mayor, who later, Mayor Dickens, hated us, right? Dossiers on our members. Although none of us got arrested, we had our records subpoenaed. We had warrants on, not warrants, our records were subpoenaed in terms of our bank records, which we found out from the warrants of other people when they searched their houses. They were looking for stuff on our organization. So we understood that the black bourgeoisie, again, served a particular role for trying to get a critical mass of our people to believe in the propaganda in the police. That is a war that we have to be on the front lines of fighting. We have to convince people that these folks are not our friends, that these folks are not working for our community, that historically and currently, when the brother mentioned black power, remember, black power was turned into a tool of the capitalist class, right? Because they started saying black power meant black capitalism. So we have to remember that the black bourgeoisie will do anything to begin to twist radical language, black power language, for the purposes of their own stake in the system, but mainly for the purposes of stopping our people from mobilizing and organizing our people and us radicalizing them. So our major fight will be against the black bourgeoisie before any other segment. It is a class warfare.
I think that's a great place to end it. We're gonna move into time for people to get their book signs if they have that. But just want to say again, thank you, Kamau, for being here. We really appreciate having you here, and thank you all of you. Oh, and yes.
Yep. Hey, peace, family. Give it up, please, one more time for Kamau Franklin. Absolutely. Thank you to all the members of the Pan-African Community Action, the Black Alliance for Peace, and the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement for being here and for all the work that you do. And I also just want to briefly recognize Evan Wright, our host this evening. Evan is one of those special people who really gives of himself and his knowledge that he has of how to pull the levers that make things happen while battling against the system. So we're really grateful for him. He's been doing a lot of invaluably important work for Sankofa, for this space, as the space transitions into a co-op. And we're extremely, absolutely. And we are extremely grateful for that work. So we've been clapping, but please, one more time for Evan Wright. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., one of the greatest musicians in Washington, D.C., Free Benjamin, will be performing at an event we're hosting here at 7 p.m. called Haiti on Our Mind. Haiti on Our Mind is part of the On Our Mind series at Sankofa, which includes Gaza on Our Mind, Congo on Our Mind, Sudan on Our Mind, and Haiti on Our Mind, where we use music, art, and scholarship to interrogate these liberation struggles and their origins. We're grateful for your presence here with us tonight, and we hope to see you tomorrow and in the future. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sankofa and company for facilitating this excellent engagement in this event. Thank you, Kamau, for your excellent contributions, and I appreciate it and look forward to engaging the text. And thank you, Evan, my comrade, for facilitating and these excellent questions. I'm representing Pan-African Community Action. My name is Johannes. In the back right here, we have some literature on some of our ongoing programs. A little bit about Pan-African Community Action. We're a community-based organization organizing for power in Southeast DC. So we invite you to join us for this upcoming Black August. We have weekly events on Wednesday. So this is where you could learn about specifically some of the struggles from our political prisoners, and we're focusing on health in this upcoming Black August. And so you'll learn a bit more about what Black August is, about the Black radical tradition, as you know, with in mind our ancestors and elders that have represented our struggle in the truest sense and given all of themselves. And then beyond that, we invite you to learn more about the People's Pan-African Wellness Front, which is a program in which we are fighting for community control of health. And so what that looks like in Mpaka's vision right now is developing relationships in Wards 7 and 8, most closely around One Black Workers and Wellness Center, where we operate out of. And so there's opportunities to volunteer for door knocking, to develop those relationships, as well as, develop those relationships, as well as join us through the end of the summer, in which we're hoping to launch, develop the program further to get to the point where we are offering blood sugar testing blood pressure testing and blood sugar readings and all else. And so this is an effort for a long-term vision in which we have a physical space in which we're able to have community-led and community-serving facilities. And so this is an example of some of the community building that we've heard about today and some of these struggles going on in Atlanta. This is an international struggle. This is an example of what this looks like in y'all's backyard. So please come engage us. There's many APACA members in this room, MXGM as well, BAP representatives. And so if you're not able to join us through August, we have our popular education series that follows August every second and fourth Wednesday. So just come out, just sign your name. Please give us a contact, and we appreciate y'all. Thank you.